Friends, thank you very much for joining us. James, very good to see you again.
Very good to see you too, Ian. Yeah.
Long time no see.
Very long time no see. Yeah, it feels like ages.
It does feel like that, doesn't it? Well, it's been a long time for our viewers. You know, a week is a long time in football or politics. Week
Yeah.
is a long time in politics. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, quite.
all this excitement of the past week, we need to remind our viewers what they ought to do. Never mind all the things that have been happening last week, just focus on the scriptures. So,
Yeah, so
and on the video.
yeah, indeed. Yeah, so do click like on the videos on YouTube. That's really helpful. Means they're seen by more people. Do subscribe to the channel. That's always
Yes, do
good. Get a
subscribe and hit.
notification.
Yeah.
Share on the social media.
Yeah.
That's always
You've
good.
gone back to the social media. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm a
that's
great
fine.
believer in the social media as
Okay,
a
fine.
sort of
Yeah.
title.
Yeah,
I lump it all into one thing really. And
of
then
course.
do comment
Mm.
wherever you want to, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, on Ian's blog. That would be
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we do. It's interesting. Some weeks we do have quite a bit of debate. Some weeks things sort of pass, they're straightforward, and
Yeah.
others there's some interesting discussions.
So, yeah, something leaps out, and we've had so many fantastic contributions in the past.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah,
Keep them coming.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, do.
Yeah.
Now, James, where are we in the lectionary? We're still marching through Mark, are we not?
We are still marching through Mark, and we're in a period of looking at sequential passages. So we've got it's Trinity 7 this week,
Yeah.
and we've got Mark 6:14 to 29, which is the story. Well, I mean, a horrific story, as we will no doubt explore, of the beheading of John the Baptist. One of the sort of perhaps the goriest scenes in the Gospels, apart from the crucifixion. So
Yeah, it is. And it follows on from last week in terms of the fact that it's following the next verse. But of course, we talked about the fact last week that it doesn't really follow on, because actually the way that Mark has arranged his material is different from the way that in the end the chapters were divided up, and the lectionary has tended to follow the chapter divisions. And so we feel a bit sorry for the lectionary here, because we think that Stephen Langton in the 13th century, who divided the chapters up, has actually slightly led the lectionary astray.
We do, don't we? Yeah, and so we are in the middle here of a Mark and dovetail, a Mark and sandwich.
Yeah.
Last week we dealt with one slice of the bread on the outside. This week we're dealing with the jam or the meat, whichever you preferred sandwiches, on the inside. And then next week we get to the other slice of bread on the other side of the sandwich. So it is a little bit piecemeal, but I think it's absolutely vital, isn't it, Ian, that we read this story in its context.
Yes, absolutely.
Because otherwise it will just not make sense.
No, it is. And actually, one of the things that we've both been reflecting about is that this is a passage where you can't really do a verse-by-verse commentary. And in fact, we're not going to do that. I think we're going to stand back a little bit and look at the whole thing. And in fact, the commentators often don't do a verse-by-verse commentary on this.
No, they don't. Interesting. Very interesting. Both of the commentaries I read on this are not verse-by-verse at all.
Yeah.
Concentrating much more on the whole sweep of the narrative. I mean, Mark tells the story brilliantly. I mean, even though it's a horrible story, he does tell it brilliantly, as he so often does. And I think that in itself almost defies the verse-by-verse commentary. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Now, we need to sort of explore a little bit. One of the things that people often do with this passage is they treat it as a morality tale. And I think we're probably going to get to the point of saying, actually, that's not the way to read it. I mean, the question is, if you do read it as a morality tale, what is the moral of the story? Well, I would suggest that one of the morals of the story is try not to choose as your father a bloodthirsty, power-hungry lunatic who goes around killing his wife and his,
exactly,
and all, and all that kind of thing. So actually, sorry, I'm getting confused here. I'm talking about Herod the Great here. I mean, but we need to set the context. So Herod here, this King Herod, is one of the sons of Herod the Great.
He is, absolutely.
And the territory, Herod the Great's territory, was divided.
Yeah.
So this Herod Antipas here, now he actually rules two bits of divided territory, if I remember correctly. So some territory to the east of the Jordan, but also territory to the north of Galilee as well. So he actually got two bits of territory together. But of course, his father, Herod the Great, was the one who forged a regime from nothing, was a monumental builder, and he was the one who executed his own wife and two sons. But it means that, this context here is one of insecurity, it's bitter rivalry. It's a sense where, even this Herod doesn't have a sense of security about his reign.
No.
And we know from Josephus, for example, that John the Baptist movement was very significant. A lot of people following, well, I mean, as Mark's Gospel has told us. So you could see why an insecure ruler who sort of inherited a fragmented territory is going to feel both fascinated but also terrified by a figure like John, who seems to be leading a kind of a popular uprising.
I think that's right. I think his personal weakness, which of course, I mean, many of his characteristics of Herod Antipas echo the characteristics of Herod the Great. I mean, it's like father, like son, as we would say.
Yeah.
I think that weakness in his own personality probably makes him fascinated by John the Baptist, and because John the Baptist is a very strong personality who's standing up to him, isn't he? So on the sort of personal level, there's a kind of, you can absolutely understand that fascination with somebody, that almost that wishing that he was like John the Baptist and courageous and brave, which he is not. But then at the political level, that it also makes sense, doesn't it? In the sense that, you've got, as you say, the circumstances of his rule are such that he's not, he's not secure. And interesting, ultimately, he's banished by Caligula to Gaul, I think, towards the end of his life. He suffers a severe defeat in battle, and so the weakness of his reign ends in tragedy, really. So. This story works both at the political and the spiritual and the personal level, and it does make sense. But as you say, best thing in life is try not to be the son of a father like that. So,
no crime. And I mean, that challenge you mentioned is explicit here in verse 18. I said we're not going to do a verse commentary, but you can see that for John had been saying to Herod, "It's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." I mean. Yes, there's some ironic connections there with the founding of the Church of England, isn't there, in terms of marriage and morality and Henry VIII and all that kind of thing.
Indeed.
But also, it's interesting that you talk about that contrast between John as someone of a strong character. Here he is, again, let's coin this modern phrase, speaking truth to power.
Yes.
So John is unhesitatingly. I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit. There are echoes here of the portrayal of John the Baptist in the beginning of Luke's Gospel, where all sorts of people come to him, and he's absolutely unequivocal in what the moral demands of the gospel are. In fact, it's quite extraordinary. That I was just very struck. I was reading it again recently last week, and where in Luke 3, people say, well, what should we do? The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent. And he says, show the fruits of repentance. Don't just say you're repenting, but actually live a different life. And they say, well, what should we do? He says, whoever has 2 cloaks must give one to the one who has none. And whoever has food should share it with the one who has none. And then they say, oh, perhaps this one's the Messiah. And thinking, wow, that's... He's just told people to give away their clothes, and now they're saying, hey, this is the Messiah. I mean, it's interesting that the directness and the challenge, the uncompromising challenge of his teaching. And the other thing I've noticed, and I don't know whether you made this connection, is that we actually get a hint of this dynamic in a kind of political, cartoony kind of way when Jesus is being challenged in Jerusalem. And he says, I'll answer this question as long as you answer me the question about, whose ministry was John the Baptist.
Yeah.
And at one point he says, when you went out to the desert to see John the Baptist, so clearly assuming everyone did, what did you expect to see? A reed blowing in the wind? Someone wearing fine clothes, soft clothes? Well, both of those, I don't know if you realise, those were an attack on Herod Antipas. Because Herod Antipas's own sign on his coins was reeds.
That's right. Yes.
And also he was someone who was dressed in fine clothes or soft clothes. Well, the word soft, we know from Paul, is malakos, which also is a euphemism for morally soft. Well, it's sexually soft as well. So, compromised.
No, interesting, isn't it? And I mean, one of the other interesting things that structurally about this passage, of course, there's only 2 passages in the whole of Mark's Gospel that are not about Jesus. And they're both about John. So there's that opening passage right at the beginning of chapter 1, and then there's this passage here, which is about John. So I think what Mark is doing here is very closely connecting the stories of John and Jesus. And if you reflect on this death of John here, it has a number of parallels, doesn't it, with the death of Jesus? So you have, both are executed by political tyrants. Both of those tyrants are weak. They vacillate and they succumb to social pressure. They both John and Jesus essentially die silently as victims of political corruption, and both die as righteous and innocent. So there's a really interesting kind of, the forerunner of Jesus is John, but he foreruns also into death in a similar way. So it's a fascinating way in which Mark puts these stories together. Yeah.
And the dynamic here in this account as well between Herod and John, that, I think verse 20 is very striking. For Herod feared John. That's a fascinating description. Isn't it? Here's someone with, military power, someone who's inherited, at least part of a significant kingdom, and is enjoying the buildings that Herod the Great was known for as well, and palaces and so on. But he feared him, knowing he was a righteous and holy man.
Yeah.
And he kept him safe. So although he knew he was a dangerous opponent and therefore imprisoned him, he couldn't have somebody, undermining his authority. But actually, it's interesting, fascinating that he says that, he kept him safe.
Yeah, yeah. And also that in that respect, I mean, he seems to have a high opinion of John, doesn't he? In that respect. But then we've just heard, as we looked at last week, the low opinion which Jesus' own people and particularly his own family actually have on him. That's a fascinating. I mean, Mark is well known for his irony, and I think there's something quite ironic, really, about that going on here as well.
Yes, there is. When he heard John, Herod says he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. Well, as you say, it's the exact opposite of what's happened, where Jesus has gone to Nazareth and they have not heard him gladly at all. No. They've heard him reluctantly. Then they've kicked him out and said, "We don't want anything to do with you."
Yeah, taking offence at him. Yeah.
It is curious, though, as well. I mean, you hinted this at the beginning, where Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and yet when he tells a story, he tells it at great length. We've noticed this, quite often before, and a lot of the parallel, including this one, when the stories appear in the other Gospels, particularly Matthew, they get extremely compressed and shortened. I also wonder whether, and again, I don't know if the commentators make any mention of this, but isn't it interesting that a moment of decisive judgment comes at a feast? I mean, obviously, one of the obvious predecessors to that is Daniel.
And
Belshazzar's feast. Yeah. So, but again, it's told in such entertaining detail that Herodias' daughter came and she danced, and she pleased Herod's guests, and you get this real sense of dramatic build up into the sort of Herod's feckless hubris, where he just gets carried away with with his daughter, and just loses any sense of proportional self-control and says, "I'll give you whatever you want." I vows half my kingdom. I suppose there's another little allusion to that as well, which is Jephthah's daughter, where he says, he vows recklessly to God, whatever greets me in the house, I will sacrifice to you as well.
Yes, we've just been reading that in morning prayer recently, haven't we? And it's it's an extraordinary story. There is this. I mean, hubris in powerful kings is quite common in Scripture, isn't it? And but there is this vulnerability because of the hubris. I mean, I think in the Daniel story, Darius promises, make third in the kingdom if you can interpret the dream, and here it's half my kingdom if you know. But then he gets the story is extraordinary, really, because he is completely manipulated by Herodias, isn't he?
Yeah,
completely. He's utterly weak and really rather pathetic. I mean, I think he comes out as a pathetic character. As the story continues. You feel, while he's still listening to John and fascinated by him, you feel as though he's got a bit of hope. But as soon as Herodias gets a roar in, it's all downhill. Once again,
he's painted.
Yeah, brilliant Mark and story.
Sorry, he's painted himself into a corner, hasn't he?
Yeah. And then he's so morally weak that he won't do the right thing to get out of the corner. He won't. He's so before all his courtiers and everybody, he can't afford to make that political gamble. That's what he thinks, anyway.
Indeed. Now, a few years ago, I went on holiday with my family to Malta,
Mm.
We actually went to Gozo in the north, and we visited Malta.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's interesting is because in St John's Co-Cathedral there's a painting by Caravaggio.
Mm.
He himself also impulsive and conflicted,
Indeed.
but a genius.
Yes.
And I'm just going to share the painting here because you can't actually, you're not allowed to take your cameras. The security is very. I don't know if have you actually seen it in Malta?
No, I haven't. No, no. Only I've
Okay.
only seen reproduction. Mm.
It is. I mean, actually, to see the painting in real life is incredibly powerful. But it is the painting of this scene. So let me just screen share here. There we go. So there's the painting, and what I found fascinating about this painting is a sort of a key to understanding the passage. Just as Mark has this really impressive storytelling technique, Caravaggio has this incredible painting technique,
Yeah.
where he uses this tenebrism technique, where there's a very striking contrast between the light and the dark. So the light comes in from a particular direction, and you can see it shining on the back of the executioner. And he's actually chosen the moment, which is mentioned in the text towards verse 20, I think it is, where somebody goes down to the dungeon where John is and executes him.
Yeah.
And he's literally just cut his throat, and you can see the horror of it. So you've got people on the right of the picture who are sort of the onlookers going, "What on earth's going on here?" Other people who are locked up. You've got the horror of the woman in the
Middle. Yeah.
scene there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then you've got the young woman there who's simply just holding out the platter,
Yeah.
ready
Waiting for
her.
it to be put on it, and
Yeah,
the chap who seems to be entirely unmoved, pointing to the platter, saying, "Right, could put the head on
yeah,
there," which
yeah,
which
very
is
matter of fact. Yeah,
frightening, isn't it? In its inhumanity.
yeah,
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 and then of course you've got the light also falls on fascinating on the other two prisoners behind the
yeah. Just their faces.
just their
Yes.
faces to show their fascination and in a sense they're onlookers like us, aren't they? That's
Yeah,
what in a sense that's the
yeah,
the,
yeah.
the way it works.
And then the
Yeah.
most fascinating detail, which you probably can't see on the screen here,
No,
is
you
that the
can't quite see
blood
it.
that
No.
flows from John the Baptist's neck flows down to form Caravaggio's own signature.
Yeah, yeah.
So Caravaggio says, actually, I'm complicit here. But there's actually quite interesting backstory to this, isn't there, for Caravaggio
There is,
himself?
yeah, because Caravaggio is, he had a very, very, as you say, checkered life, and
Yeah.
he's meant to have murdered somebody in Rome and fled to Malta,
Hmm.
and he's been excommunicated and everything, and he paints this painting almost as an attempted act of atonement,
Hmm.
and so he's meant to have signed I Caravaggio did it in the painting, or
Hmm. Hmm.
something like
Hmm.
that. It meant to be an
Hmm.
admission of guilt anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether that convinced the Knights of Malta for whom he painted it that he was worthy of
Hmm.
being rehabilitated is another
Hmm.
matter. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's clearly a painting painted in extremist circumstances for him personally, and perhaps
Yeah.
some of what's in there reflects his own
Angst.
perceptions of
Yeah.
angst.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as always with
Um,
Caravaggio, it's a remarkable painting.
It is. It is really, really remarkable, and also often from an unusual angle as well, an unusual perspective, because he
Yeah.
sees himself very much involved in it.
Yes. Yeah.
But what's interesting is that I think one of the things that Caravaggio does is it helps us move away from simply seeing this story as a kind of morality tale, and he sees the bigger significance. Now, I mean, you've already talked about the fact that there are so many parallels between the death of John the Baptist and the death of Jesus. Now, one thing that just literally occurs to me as I say that to you is that isn't it fascinating that Mark slows the narrative down and goes into the detail and lets us focus on this really in all its detail. And of course, when it comes to the death of Jesus, he does exactly the same.
He does.
So, the actual passion narrative in Mark's gospel occupies a huge
Yeah.
proportion
Yeah.
of the gospel, and he goes into every single detail. So already he's drawing the parallels there in that way.
Yes. Yeah. And and I think the painting's fascinating, isn't it? In the sense that you could be, and initially, and indeed throughout, really, you're drawn to the character of Herod, as this despotic tyrant who's completely, as we've just been rehearsing. And yet in this painting, Herod is absent. And in a sense, it's the executioner and John who take center stage.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and the point in a sense here is, often people ask you, all those things that people say now is, well, who do you identify with in this Bible story? Well,
Yes.
I think Mark is quite intentional here that we're meant to be identifying with John the Baptist, not
Yeah.
with Herod,
Yeah.
clearly,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
clearly not with anybody else. But
Yeah.
this is about what discipleship costs,
Yeah.
and it's going to cost. I mean, Jesus as the master, as the leader, it's going to cost him his
Yeah.
life. So why
Yeah.
should it cost us anything less? Is part of the story. And
Yeah.
the disciples, have been out on mission just before this, and will return from mission immediately after this.
Yes.
They're living that costliness, and will do throughout their lives, right to the end, and some of them will be martyred.
Yeah.
So it's a really sobering story. And Mark does not pull punches about the
No,
gospel,
he
does
doesn't.
he?
No, he really doesn't. No. One little detail in the story I've just noticed is from verse 29, we get a mention of the disciples of John the Baptist, his
Yes.
disciples.
Yeah.
Verse 30, when we get the second half of that sandwich of the sending of the 72, actually just to distinguish them from John's disciples, they're here called the apostles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas
Mark
in
doesn't use
last
that.
week, in the previous episode, they were actually called Jesus' disciples, but now
Yeah.
they're being referred to as a distinct group. I mean, again, that's just a little detail I've only just noticed as we read this. Interestingly, again in the other gospel parallels, that when the 12 come back, particularly in Luke, they go on about how wonderful it is, and
Yeah.
we saw, and Jesus said, "I saw Satan fall like lightning," and so on, because it isn't juxtaposed with this story in the same way. There's just another little parallel thing to note here. Sorry, this is really is an aside, and we'll come back to the significance of the story. But of course, one of the things it's worth asking: why does Mark need to fill out? Why has he got a space to fill with the story of John the Baptist? I mean, it obviously serves a theological purpose, but from a narrative and temporal point of view, the answer is, well, the question is, what does Jesus do while the disciples are out doing all their
Yes.
ministry?
Yes. Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
I think, again, the most convincing answer, and I'm sorry I'm being a bit of a Richard Borkham fan here, Richard Borkham points out that the fourth gospel dovetails with this perfectly, because the fourth gospel doesn't mention the sending of the 72, but Jesus goes on his own down to Jerusalem. And this is where in chapter 5, and he heals the man by the pool.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and then he comes back, and then in John 6, he's the feeding of the 5,000, which we also find as the next episode in Mark's Gospel here.
Yes.
So you have a really, really neat dovetailing. It's one of several books where the
Yeah.
chronology of Mark and the chronology of the fourth Gospel actually dovetail very precisely together, which does reinforce the fact that you've got eyewitness kind of details in Mark, you've got eyewitness kind of details in the fourth Gospel, and then their chronologies go together. So it does suggest that the fourth Gospel writer is assuming that we've read Mark's Gospel.
Yeah. 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 As we noticed a lot when we were looking at John, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a really interesting observation, Ian. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, here's the interesting thing about the end of this narrative with Herod, which was, I think this is so poignant. When his disciples heard of it, they came and they took his body and laid it in a tomb.
Yeah.
Now, this is incredibly moving, isn't it? Because when you think about it, all they've got is his torso.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the head is on a platter
Yeah.
in the feast. And of course, here's the irony. In Herod's feast, what do you use the platter for? To serve up the finest delicacies. And now what he's serving up? He's serving up judgment on his own kingdom because of his own hubris. That's what the guests are now seeing.
Yeah.
And it seems to me really poignant that the disciples take this headless body,
Yes.
and they themselves as a group are now a headless body.
Yeah.
They no longer have their leader.
Yeah.
They're disciples with no one to follow.
Yeah.
And again, here's an interesting contrast with Jesus. What happens? I mean, it's really interesting, and a lot of stuff on the Unbelievable website, and a lot of stuff that apologists are now saying, well, hang on a second. One of the problems that skeptics have about the Christian movement is, hey, have we heard of the international movement following John the Baptist? No, we haven't, because he died, and then his movement petered out.
Yes.
What about Honi the Circle Maker? What about all the other pretenders, the Messianic pretenders? Every single one of them has died, and their movement died out.
Yeah.
Jesus, as you say, had the same kind of death as John the Baptist, but here we are today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
his headless body did not die,
No. No.
and you've
No.
got to sort of say, well, what's the explanation for that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other interesting aspect of this story is that, as we mentioned, there's a clear rejection of the mission of Jesus going on in Nazareth, in some of the towns of Galilee, and
Yeah,
now in the sort of echelons of power in Galilee as well.
mm,
And what
yeah,
happens from now on is that Jesus essentially withdraws and takes the 12 with him. In
yeah,
fact, we have that withdrawal after the feeding of the 5,000, and so he
yeah,
begins to reconstitute the people of God around the 12.
yeah, mm, mm,
So it is sort of a significant moment in his ministry. It's one of in a sense one of those trigger points, like Peter's confession in Mark 8, where
mm,
Jesus, where
mm, mm,
Peter
mm,
confesses Jesus as the Christ, and this is apparently
mm,
a moment when that's kind of a signal to Jesus to now set his face towards Jerusalem and so on.
yeah,
So this seems to be
yeah,
a moment where Jesus sets his face to recreate the people of God around himself and the
yeah,
12 disciples,
yeah,
who will then become
yeah,
the ones through whom the good news is
mm,
shared. So
mm,
it's quite an important
mm,
pivotal moment, I think.
yeah.
Mm.
And I think there's also something else about what happens when, well, I mean, physical decapitation is just such a dreadful thing and a
Mm.
powerful thing. I mean, I'm still going back and I'm moved every time I think about it for the when ISIS beheaded the 20 Christian Copts in
Yeah,
2015.
yeah, yeah.
And of course, what they thought they were doing by filming this was that they were instilling a sense of fear and death in anyone
Mm.
who opposed them. Whereas, in fact, actually, what happened was the relatives of those who were beheaded heard them all cry out, "Jesus is Lord," before they died.
Yeah, yeah, of
And then
course.
the story of the additional, the 21st one, who it's said saw the way they died and said, "Actually, I'm one with them."
Yeah,
But also the way that nations, the way that organisations, what happens when they are, as it were, metaphorically decapitated as well. I found it really shocking when I first learned just a few years ago that, when the Nazis went into Poland, their aim their strategy was to decapitate the nation,
yeah,
and they rounded up university professors, political leaders, religious
yep,
leaders, and they executed them all,
yeah,
millions of them.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they killed 3 million Jews, but they also killed 2 million non-Jewish Poles
Yes,
for
they
the
did.
leader.
Yeah, yeah,
They
which
wanted
people often
they wanted
forget.
to turn them into a sort of slave nation,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is extraordinary. And I suppose there's a question there about how we view leadership, how we see leadership in the local church. I mean,
mm,
we made jokes about, what happens when an outsider last week, what happens when an outsider comes in, and we prefer to hear that than
yeah. We did.
the
Yeah,
regular
mm,
bit. But it's interesting how, in the situation we're in the Church of England as well, and how
mm,
many of us are feeling ambivalent about the leadership of the
mm,
church and what that does to an organization.
yeah,
It's really challenging that, in a sense, Jesus' death and his going away from us and the gift of the Spirit says, well, in fact, if you are, as a people filled with the Spirit, you don't need a hierarchy of leadership in the way
no,
that other people assume they do.
no, no, you don't. No, no, quite. Yeah. Well, there we are. It's a sobering reading, isn't it? On so many levels, and for us personally in our discipleship, but as you say, in all
Mm,
these
mm,
national and global situations of leadership,
yeah.
we're both in this country and in America, in
Mm,
France currently. We're all this whole question of what leadership looks like is being put to the people. Beware of what you wish for, and all of that. It's
yeah.
yeah, it's really challenging.
Mm.
And actually,
But
also interesting, I think the dearth of leaders um, who perhaps don't have the hubris that's around today in so much national leadership.
yeah,
There is a
yeah,
lot of it, isn't there?
yeah. There is. But the final note is the one actually beyond
Yeah,
our
yeah,
passage for the week, actually,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is that the apostles returned to Jesus and they told him all that they had done and taught. And of course, that phrase, doing and teaching, is again
Mm,
characteristic of Jesus. So there you are, the disciples who are knowing the cost of discipleship, they're actually being faithful to the ministry of Jesus, and they are continuing to do what he's commissioned them to do, which is what he calls us to as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
James, thank you very much. Friends, thank you for joining us. A slightly different exploration of the passage this week, but we hope that you found that fruitful as well. Don't forget to do those 4 things: to like, to subscribe, to share on the social media, and do comment as well. And we look forward to seeing you next time. James, see you next week.
Yeah.